All right, everyone. I've got another guest on my channel today, and this has been a long time coming. We've got Robin over at Bookspin on today.
Thank you, Ira, for inviting me. It's a pleasure
Yeah,
to be here.
it's a pleasure to finally meet you in person and talk to you. I've watched your channel for a long time. Yours was one of the ones I was watching before I started my channel, and always enjoyed your content. So it's good to have you on the channel.
Yeah, and likewise, I think I've been following your channel pretty much since it started.
Well,
So,
yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So I've been reading through this list of the masterpieces of science fiction. It's just this list that Easton Press put together, and I put out like a call to other booktubers to come on the channel and do some of these videos with me. And I sent out a list to Robin, and what we decided to read in this one is The Fountains of Paradise by Arthur C. Clarke. And you've read quite a few Arthur C. Clarke books, is that right?
Not that many, actually. This is only my third one.
Okay.
I've read 2001, which I loved, and Child's End, which I also loved. Actually, I've not been disappointed by anything I've read by him yet.
Yeah, I've read those two plus Rendezvous with Rama. So I guess this would be my fourth. And I recently saw you had some of the sequels to 2001. I'm very curious to read those at some point as well.
Yes, I'm thinking of doing that as a series read at some point in the future. And I'm a big fan of the 2001 movie. So yeah, at some point, I'm going to revisit that series and go through the whole books. Although I've heard that some of the sequels are varying quality, but we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah. So this one was one that Clarke did a little later in his career. It came out in 1979, and it won the Nebula and the Hugo for Best Novel, I think the next year in like 1980. And so I didn't really know much going into this one, but as I started reading it, I remembered, oh yeah, this is the space elevator novel. So the concept had come out scientifically, but I believe this is the first real novel that got into the idea of a space elevator. And there's been a lot of books since then that have brought up that topic as well. So once I started reading it and realizing that was what this book was about, I got really excited because I'm into engineering, and I knew that was going to be a focal point of this book. So I'll just start off by saying I really enjoyed this book. It goes into way more than just the engineering aspect. We're going to get into that a little bit more. We might talk spoiler light a bit. We'll warn you if we do, but we talked before we started the video. There's not really too much to spoil about this novel, but there's a couple things that will just maybe warn you if you want to like skip ahead just a few seconds or whatever. So do you want to give a quick overall impression of what you thought of this one?
I also really enjoyed it. I think, like everything I've read by Clarke so far, it reflects his fascination with space exploration and the universe and human potential. And I think it does it in a very interesting way because it's not just an intriguing hard SF novel, but it kind of interweaves this space elevator plot with various other things. We've got a historical narrative which gets explored along the side, and we get a bit more fleshed out characters than I've come across in other Clarke books that I've read. And overall, I'm really pleased with it. I think I might even go. I've only read 3 Clarke books so far, but I might go so far as to say this is probably my favorite.
All right.
Yeah.
So yeah, it sounds like we both liked it. So let's get into the plot a little bit of this one here. So I'll maybe start off with a little bit, and then you can kind of fill in as we go. But when we start off with this one, Arthur C. Clarke spent a lot of his life in Sri Lanka, and he brought a lot of that to this novel. He kind of fictionalized parts of the island and exaggerated some of the geological features, to make this like one of the premier places to build this space elevator. And but what we get in the beginning of this one too is we get flashbacks from like almost 1,000 years prior, where there was some things going on in this area where they built this thing that was called the Fountain of Paradise. And it brought a lot of myth that gets interwoven into the modern day story of this one as well, which I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, it is interesting how he intersects these two stories, which, you know, when we put them like that, it doesn't really feel like there's any connection between them, but there is a kind of connection. So in the ancient narrative, we've got this king, what's his name? Kalidasa.
Yep.
And he's got this this kind of rock fortress, and he's building these pleasure gardens, the Fountains of Paradise. And so he's got these kind of big projects going on, these big ambitions for engineering, but also for his kingdom and his legacy. Meanwhile, in the present, when our protagonist is this engineer who's also very visionary, Dr. Morgan, and it's he who proposes the space elevator project. So in some ways, you've got these two characters who they're living in very different time periods and they've got vastly different levels of technology, but they're working towards a similar kind of vision. And they're both taking place in this kind of fictionalized version of Sri Lanka, which Clarke calls Taprobane, which I looked up. It's apparently, I think it's like the ancient Greek name for Sri Lanka.
Okay.
And yeah, it's kind of interesting. And I think on a personal level, I found the Sri Lankan aspect to this story quite compelling, because that's where I went for my honeymoon 10 years ago. And we can talk a little bit more about the mountain in a minute, because that's has quite an important place within the story. But I've climbed that mountain with my wife. I've seen the sunrise on that mountain, and it's quite integral to the narrative, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, there's like, it's not just like some foreshadowing, which is these parallels between these two time periods. There's almost like some metaphor of what's going on. And it is funny talking about this, especially if someone hasn't read the book, because you wouldn't think that these things would have anything to do with one another. But he wove them together really well, I think. And in the beginning, you get a lot of background about this king and what happened with his father and his brother, and what ends up happening to him. And it even in the future, some of the events still are kind of being played out in a way from some of these myths and some of these things that were going on. And that was really fascinating. It's like I've seen Greek mythology and science fiction and other types of mythology, but nothing like quite like this woven in. So I really enjoyed that as well.
Right. So yeah, we've got this mountain, which is proposed as the building site for this giant space elevator, which, by the way, is well, we should explain what is the point of the space elevator, because obviously it's a massive engineering project. But I think the idea of the space elevator is to connect Earth's surface with to a kind of geostationary orbit, right? So that we have a cost-effective means of transmitting people and goods out into space, and this is kind of a gateway to space colonization and exploring the stars. I think that's the essential vision of the project. But we mentioned this mountain because it has to be built on the equator, right? And it has to be on an elevated site. And it just so happens that there's this one mountain which is in the right spot. And so this engineer, Dr. Morgan, he wants to build this, like, however tall it is, 36,000 kilometer tall elevator into space on top of this mountain. But it's not any mountain, it's a sacred mountain. It's the home to an ancient order of Buddhists. So you've also got this kind of religious and spiritual conflict going on, because obviously they don't want a giant space elevator in their backyard.
Yeah.
So I found that aspect of the story quite compelling.
Yeah, the engineer, this Van, he's basically the main character in this one, and he had done the world's largest bridge where he connected Africa to Europe, right? I believe it was. And so this was like the largest feat of engineering. So he had the technical skill, and he comes in. He's very ambitious, but it gets into a lot of the engineering that would have to go with this, but also the dealing with this order at this site, trying to get permission, getting financial backing. There's the whole background of getting a project like this going, which would be, the largest project ever done. And this space elevator can very efficiently move loads up, and basically coming down, you generate electricity, and it kind of offsets some of the power required to go up. So as opposed to using rockets to send everything up, this is going to transform the space industry as far as getting things up off the surface of the Earth. And we already have people on Mars and the moon here in this future. Right. So there's already some commerce and some stuff going on, and this can just really open humanity up to the solar system.
Yeah, another point to note is that the way that this technology is possible is through a hypothetical substance called hyperfilament, which is a kind of super strong carbon material, which is used to build the pillars. It's probably a better word to use.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It basically is a kind of superfine material which can never break, right? And it kind of reminded me of I've seen similar concepts in other science fiction novels. Like, I think there's something like that in the Three-Body Problem. But yeah, it did get me wondering, because Arthur C. Clarke himself was not just a sci-fi writer, he was also a scientist. I think he had degrees in physics and maths and what have you, and was a big proponent of space travel. And this book does go into quite a lot of technical detail. And it got me wondering just how it feels very plausible, right? The way he describes it, apart from maybe the hyperfilament element, which I don't think really exists, but it is at first, when they first came up with the idea, I think, okay, a 36,000 kilometer tower is ridiculous. But the way Arthur C. Clarke explains it, he makes it sound plausible without going overboard on technical detail. So I think he strikes a good balance. It's hard SF, but it's also quite accessible to the common reader, I think.
Yeah, I think how he explains things are very easy to envision, even if you don't know everything about all the science. But you basically get some sort of like anchor, in a way, rotating around the Earth that has the other end of this, tower to it, and it's tethered from the ground with this hyperfilament. And then you basically, the way he envisioned it too, there was like, it was rectangular, so you could run 4 cars basically, or spiders, up and down this thing. And so it's kind of hollow on the inside. And then this asteroid or man-made station or whatever you need to use out in space is kind of the other end, and it's getting pushed away from the Earth. So that's kind of like holding it all together. I don't know if you've read Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars books.
No, I haven't.
He gets really into the space elevator, but he uses like this major cable, and it's very fascinating. And this thing happens. I don't want to spoil or get into this one too much, but it becomes a really big part of one of the books, this whole space elevator. But that was written like in the 80s, like later in the 80s or 90s. So it was well after Clarke had written this one. And I know it's still talked about. I think there's still some issues with the right kind of materials to make something like this really work. But this really could be something that would, benefit mankind for sure, to get material and whatnot up off the surface of the Earth in the most efficient way.
Right. I think the only other novel that I recall which featured one was Old Man's War by John Scalzi.
Okay.
Which is obviously far different in tone to this novel.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've read it, but it's not really a very serious book. It's very humorous in tone, military sci-fi, but it very entertaining.
So as we get into the book more, there's some other things that happen. We're not going to spoil too much, because we already mentioned he flashes back about 1,000 years into the past, and then most of the book's taking part in the present. And it does go a lot over the engineering issues he's coming up with, the building of this thing. There's kind of a crisis that kind of happens that takes over part of the narrative for a while they have to try to save some people. And then you get also at the end, you get a glimpse into the future. And it kind of reminded me of some of Clarke's other works, where the heart of the novel is this one story, but he gives you some information in the past and in the future to kind of put it all together in a way. And it's pretty interesting where he ends up taking this one. I definitely didn't see him going where he went. But overall, I thought it was really well. The only thing I could personally kind of critique is that this crisis that kind of happened was interesting enough. It was entertaining, but I felt like it almost was a bit of a filler to kind of write about something, because the main idea, I think if he just focused on the engineering of this thing, it would be a lot drier and a little bit more boring of a novel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that crisis, which takes up quite a sizable chunk of the final act of the book, I did find it very gripping. But I agree, it needed to be there because to add some kind of narrative tension.
Yeah.
Just as I think as we've got the ancient historical narrative and a subplot which we've alluded to, but we haven't really talked about. We've got, so besides the main engineering project itself, if Clarke only wrote a book about the space elevator and its fruition as a project, it probably wouldn't be a very entertaining read. So I think he has to throw in these other elements to kind of make it more of an exciting novel. So yeah, but I think it works. I mean, I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And I can imagine, in some ways, I could imagine this being adapted to a movie. I think it could be done quite well. There's there's certainly quite a few cinematic moments in it.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think the way he handled the myth in the beginning, that was woven perfectly into the story. I really love that part. This crisis part that happened, it felt like kind of a side thing that was going on, but it would, like you said, it needed to be there. It kind of drove the plot. It made it kind of interesting. There was some high stakes going on, but I overall just really enjoyed the whole story.
Yeah, and I have to say, I think although it's not really a character-focused novel, I do feel that the characters in this book, especially the main engineer protagonist, feel more three-dimensional than I've read in other Clarke books. So, for example, 2001, there's basically no character development at all,
Yeah,
with the possible exception of Hal, who's not even human.
yeah,
And Childhood's End, again, it's not really character focused. It's very ideas focused. I think the characters are forgettable.
mm-hmm.
Whereas in this book, while what's his name, Van, it's not like it's a deep character study or anything, but he is quite interesting in his own right. He's got quite an interesting sort of backstory, and there's points in the book where he's kind of questioning his decisions in life and how he could have had a very different life. He's basically given up any interest or any chance to pursue romance or a family life because he's so single-mindedly focused on his engineering projects. And we don't just look at his life now, but we kind of get brief flashbacks into his past growing up and things like that. So he feels a bit more developed as a character. Yeah, I think the combination of his character, the kind of high stakes that we get once we enter this crisis later on, the historical and the mythological elements which get interweaved with the plot, I think it makes for quite a well-rounded novel, perhaps more so, dare I say it, than 2001, which I did like, but I think it did have some issues. But yeah.
Yeah, and the tech is cool. Everything about this space elevator is fascinating, especially if you're into science. Like he doesn't go over the top with it. So even if you're maybe not used to what you would call hard science fiction, I would say this would be a good one to recommend to someone to get into that. But he also there's so many other ideas that he was throwing out in 1979 about computers and this form of internet and weather control. And he had so many fascinating ideas with the tech. And the one interesting thing that he brought up in there was like he kind of thought he figured out that at some point all these computers would hold this information and it wouldn't be hard to find information. And so there was like these, you would need to be good at parsing information. So people would, quiz you by saying what was the highest rainfall in this country when a baseball game was played at night, or these just really convoluted scenarios, so that it wasn't just trying to find or come up with a fact. It was like trying to piece all of these facts together, and that was like the challenge. So I mean, that's, with Wikipedia and the internet and everything we have at our disposal, you can find any fact, but it's kind of what he was talking about, trying to figure out nuances within that and getting good at searching things out. So
Yeah.
a very visionary. Every book I've read from him, there's always some thing that has somewhat come true, and he's very good at predicting technology, I think.
One of the most compelling aspects is the conflict with the religious order, the Buddhist monks who have their monastery on the top of this mountain. And I think that that's a theme which always kind of attracts me in science fiction novels, when you get some kind of religious theme or intersection of religion and science, or a conflict between the two. And for me, like I said, I felt like I had more of a personal connection, because he, as Clarke, like clearly, like he explicitly mentions in the prologue and in the notes at the novel, he says this is 90% based on Sri Lanka, and this mountain is basically Adam's Peak, which is a sacred mountain in Sri Lanka, which is a pilgrimage site for not just for Buddhists, but for Hindus and some Muslims and Christians as well. And I think he even describes a scene in the book where the engineer, he climbs up to the summit for the sunrise to witness the famous shadow of the mountain, which is basically that is exactly how it appears in real life. It's like a mystical triangle which kind of hangs in the mist, and you can only see it for a few moments after sunrise from the top of the mountain. And once you've seen it, you'll never forget it. And that was one of my most memorable things that I witnessed when I was in Sri Lanka during my honeymoon. So I think it was quite nice to see that in this book. And who knows, maybe some people have read this, it might have inspired them to check out more about Sri Lanka and perhaps even visit, because I think it's an underrated destination.
Yeah, if it wasn't so far away, I would have it on a short list for me.
Yeah.
We love to travel, but for us, that's kind of almost halfway around the world.
Yeah. Well, I was living in China at the time, so I suppose I was on the right continent at least, but it's still quite a long way. Yeah. I don't know when Arthur C. Clarke moved to Sri Lanka, but he spent a great deal of his life there.
Yeah, I think he passed away there, and I think even in this one he mentioned, I think when he wrote it, he thought this might be his last novel. I think he did go on to write at least one more. I think.
Oh, I mean, he only died in 2008, so.
Oh, he wrote quite a bit more than.
Yeah, I know that the 2001 sequels came out in the 80s, and the last 2001 book came out in 97. So he must have written a few more in the meantime.
Well, I think authors a lot of times will say, I'm calling it after this one, and then, it's almost like the engineer, he couldn't retire, he had to keep working, so I think that happens to a lot of people.
Yeah, that's another aspect of the story, because I think so it takes place in the 22nd century, but it doesn't take place just in one point in time. It kind of, as the project of the space elevator develops, Dr. Morgan, he also ages. Yep. So later on in the book, he's kind of almost an old man, or at least very mature, but he's still kind of pushing it, and he's still kind of right in the heart of the action, which is perhaps not very wise because of his health conditions. So again, it's just another example of how he's kind of pushing himself to the limits, all in the name of progress and his engineering vision. He will stop at nothing to achieve it.
Yeah, and even other people involved in the project, they, this is a many-year project. Some of them don't get to see everything get finalized. It's just the nature of how something like this would work. But the human nature of pushing things and expanding things for humanity and whatnot, there's a lot of like thought-provoking aspects about that side of everything too, as well, I think, in this one.
Yeah.
So.
Now, there was one aspect of the story which Ira and I briefly discussed before we started recording. We think it's kind of, we're heading maybe into spoiler territory, it's spoiler light territory, but I feel like we ought to mention it.
Yeah.
Right. Because for me, this is one of my main, perhaps my only criticism of this novel. So, yeah.
Yeah, be warned. It's like not on the back of the book. I looked up some reviews. People mention it all the time. But
Yeah.
me and Robin both agreed it is a little spoiler light territory. So you could skip a few seconds or maybe 20 seconds or so if you don't want to hear this part.
So yeah, there was another subplot which introduces a first contact element to the story, in which an interstellar space probe appears in our solar system from, I can't remember where, but from some distant star.
Mm-hmm.
This is basically an evidence of an advanced alien civilization, and so we make contact with these beings, and they learn a bit about us, and we learn some information from them. And this is all very interesting, but it's kind of inserted as a chapter or two into the narrative, and then it kind of gets put in the background. I'm trying to remember the name of the probe. Doesn't matter, but yeah, I was a little bit confused when this got introduced into the story, because it doesn't seem to have much bearing on the main plot, and it felt like quite an interesting sort of narrative in its own right. But did it really need to be in this story? That was a little bit confusing for me.
Yeah, and it does come around a little bit. I'm not going to spoil what happens with it, but and he does use it to bring up some interesting things, but it did feel a little out of place, because this is like a mechanical probe. There's no actual life on board, but humanity can ask this thing questions, right? There was no aliens in it, right?
No, it's just I think it's like an AI program.
Yeah. And so humanity gets a chance to ask a bunch of questions, and the time delay of it communicating with its home planet like prevents any kind of back and forth. But there's some really interesting things he brings up. It's definitely thought provoking, but did it really have anything to do with the story? I don't know. It's hard to say.
I mean, I've not read Rendezvous with Rama. I know you have, but from what I know of that book, I think it's got definite Rendezvous with Rama vibes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it would perhaps would have worked better as a separate thing, as its own story or novel or whatever. I didn't think it needed to be tagged onto this story.
Right.
Although, as you say, there is a kind of aftermath, an epilogue at the end, which kind of ties this narrative together with the main space elevator plot. But I don't think it was really necessary, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. Rendezvous with Rama takes this, which was written before, and it just, that's what you want. You want a whole novel about this in a way.
Yeah.
This did feel thrown in, and then it disappears, like you said, and you're reading so much more going, wait, whatever happened to that? Did that just change the outlook of humanity, or is it? And then you do get a little bit more resolution. It makes a little bit more sense at the end. But, yeah.
I mean, to be honest, because that element of the story comes up quite early on in the novel, and I'd kind of forgotten about it. By the time we get to the final act and we've got all this, this exciting tension going on, and then that gets resolved, and then we get this epilogue, which then goes back to this first contact theme and see how everything ties together. I'd forgotten that was even part of the story by the time I got to that point in the novel.
Yeah, it was Star Glider.
Oh yeah, that was it.
Yeah.
So
it's if you watch this and you haven't read the book, it's not going to spoil much. It's not a big part of the story, but it's definitely worth mentioning because it does have implications, I guess you would say.
Yeah, but overall, I really enjoyed it. I would definitely recommend it. And I think the next Clarke book I need to read is Rendezvous with Rama. I think that's kind of the only one of his really big famous ones I haven't read yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as I'm reading through this list, I reread Childhood's End earlier. I think that was one of the first books I did because I knew I would love that one, and I knew I could, be really enthusiastic about it when I was starting my channel. I'd never read this one, and then when I get to Rendezvous with Rama and 2001, I'm very tempted to read the whole series when I get to those. So,
yeah, I've heard some very critical opinions on the Rama sequels,
yeah,
more so than the 2001 sequels.
same here. Yeah.
So you might want to sort of approach those with caution.
Yeah. I've also heard that, like with 2001, I love that story, but there's definitely some things left unresolved. And I have heard that you basically have to read all 4 books to get everything completely resolved in that one. So
Okay, yeah, I can definitely see myself continuing those. I probably wouldn't read them back to back because they
yeah.
If it's anything like the first book, they go quite heavy on the detail. There was like I said, there's very little character development in 2001, and I think I'll probably spread those books out, but I do want to continue them. Yeah.
Yeah, Arthur C. Clarke, I enjoy his writing. I work for an engineering company. I love researching about science and space in my free time. So he's not like a prose stylist. He's not usually getting deep into the characters, but the way he can describe things and these ideas he comes up with, I love that. And he has a very, I would call it serviceable prose.
Yeah.
It's easy to understand, I think, or it would be a good gateway book for someone to get into more harder science fiction. It might challenge people who are not avid science fiction readers, but very easy to understand. And he doesn't put a ton of fluff in his books. All these books are usually around 200 or 300 pages. I think this one was like 280 pages. My copy. I think yours was a little shorter than that too. Huh?
So mine is the Pan paperback, which came out in 1980, 234 pages.
Okay.
Which edition do you have?
I have the Del Rey, the U.S. paperback.
Okay. Yeah.
This one was actually, I looked it up. This one's a third printing, but the first printing had the same cover art on it, so it looks the same basically. So yeah, I think I would definitely recommend this one to pretty much anyone that's into science fiction. And if you're trying to get into more of the harder science fiction, this is a good way to maybe get exposed to some aspects of that, but you still have all this other stuff going on that keep you entertained enough to where you're not like your mind's not getting numbed by all of this exposition style science descriptions just dumped on you. There's a lot more layers to this one.
I agree. I actually found I find it a very compelling mix of styles and narratives, and I think this whole idea of interweaving the past and the present was quite compelling. The character, I won't necessarily say characters, but the main character was quite interesting.
Yeah.
And it's presented in quite a feasible way. but it doesn't get bogged down in technical detail, and it's very readable.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, great. I'm glad we picked one that we both really enjoyed. So
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add before we sign off here?
No, just thank you once again for inviting me, and I hope to appear on your channel again at some point.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun talking about this one with you, Robin. So I'm glad finally got to do one of these and meet you in person. So yeah, definitely looking forward to doing some more collaborations in the future.
Cool.